Good evening to all of you out there. It's such a pleasure to have you with us tonight on behalf of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council. It's just a pleasure to be here with you and to be here with Dan Schnur and Madison Alt. And this is a special event, I have to tell you. There's a lot going on, and we're so happy to have Dan Schnur with us for the Political Report. You know, the election, all the polls said that the election was going to be very, very close. It could even take days or weeks for us to know the outcome. But as you all know, Donald Trump swept the election and all 7 of the swing states. And it's so we truly have a lot to talk about tonight. You know, President-elect Trump has said he's going to be coming in with a lot of change, and he's got a very supportive environment to do it. He's coming in with a majority in the Senate and possibly as well in the House, and a conservative Supreme Court. So there's a lot to look at. And as you've noticed in the past few days, he's been making a lot of choices in terms of appointments for his administration. There's a saying that personnel is a big part of policy. So I'm assuming that we can talk a little bit about the possibility of what those policies might be, given the people that he's put into office, whether that be in the domestic area or foreign policy issues like Ukraine, like the Middle East, China, and so forth. So it should be a very, very interesting discussion tonight. And I'm just so glad we have Dan Schnur here to help us unpack what's going on and look ahead. It's I know you are all as anxious as I am to hear what Dan has to say about the situation. You know, we want you to be part of the conversation. Obviously, your questions are key here, and if you just go down to the Q&A section on your screen at the bottom, you can put a question in at any time during the session, and Madison Alt, our host tonight, will be asking the questions when that period comes after Dan has gone through his analysis. But if your question is not answered, you know, I mean, I know there'll be a lot of questions tonight, but the members only session afterwards, you'll get your questions answered. So if you're not a member, by the way, I strongly encourage you to become a member. It helps us out in a lot of ways. And by the way, you'll get your question answered during the members' question session. So I want to say thanks to all of you who have made donations to Los Angeles World Affairs Council over the past few months. It means a lot to us, and we truly rely. This organization relies on your generosity and your donations. And I want to let you know that we're starting our end of year giving campaign. So if you're in a position to give, we really appreciate you making your tax deductible donation to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council, and it's easy to do. You can go to the QR code, which I know Madison's going to put into the chat section there, where you can use the QR code, or go to our website, lawacth.org, or checks work too. We'd be delighted to have any way you're willing to donate to help us continue the mission of helping you understand what's going on around the nation and the world, and how it affects you, and how you can have a voice in affecting what goes on. So we appreciate, again, thank you so much for your donations. And if you're in a position to give, we would really appreciate all you can offer to help us in what we're doing. I know you're anxious to get to Dan's assessments and analysis, as I am too. So Dan, please take it away.
Oh, thank you, Richard. I appreciate the introduction and the lead up. That's very kind of you. And I'm very happy to have all of you here with us today. This is our second post-presidential election discussion. I remember doing this with all of you, or with many of you, after the election in 2020. And I know that most of you are in a very different frame of mind today than you were the last time we gathered for one of these programs. We have a lot to talk about tonight, and I think what I want to do is leave more time than we usually do. Maddie and I have talked about this. Leave a little bit more time than usual for your questions so we can take the conversation in whatever direction you want. And as Richard took the time to explain to all of you, we can certainly talk about any aspect of the campaign that's passed and what to expect going forward, both within a Trump transition and administration and on other fronts as well, both domestic and foreign. But what I want to do just to get us started is that even as we're sifting through the exit polls and the other data and analysis from last week's election, it seems to me that there are two overriding schools of thought beginning to emerge about not what happened last week, because unlike the 2016 election, where there was some doubt and some debate over whether the outcome was legitimate or not, the fact that this one was by a significantly greater margin has eliminated that discussion for the most part. But what I want to talk about is not what happened, but a couple of different potential interpretations of what we saw. The first, as Richard alluded to briefly, is just the tremendous sweep of Trump and Republicans' victories last night. Trump, of course, was elected president. He's the first Republican elected with a majority of the popular vote in 20 years since George W. Bush's reelection campaign in 2004. This is the most electoral votes that a Republican presidential nominee has achieved since the end of the Cold War, since George H.W. Bush in 1988. And we are looking at a Republican Senate of at least 53 seats, and in all likelihood, a growing likelihood of a House majority. And so there are those on the right and the left who are suggesting that this is the most significant change to take place in the American political landscape since Ronald Reagan's first election campaign in 1980. So interpretation number one is that this is a victory of extraordinary sweep and scope and magnitude for Trump and Republicans, and could fundamentally, as Reagan's election did more than 40 years ago, could represent a fundamental remaking of the American political landscape. That's one interpretation. The other interpretation suggests that this is a much less partisan and therefore a much less sweeping set of results, and rather a result that comes from a much more individual set of circumstances. Many point out that while Harris was defeated, in fact, in the 7 key swing states that we've been watching for the past several months, in 6 of those swing states, there was a campaign for governor or for U.S. Senate. And in 5 of those 6 races, the Democratic candidate won, while the Republican candidate for U.S. Senate in the state of Pennsylvania was elected. In Wisconsin, in Michigan, in North Carolina, in Arizona, and in Nevada, all Democrats running for statewide office in those states were elected. And the argument there is that this has less to do with the realignment of American politics and a long-term shift to voting behavior, and is more the result of either an individual candidate and or set of circumstances that that candidate faced, given the very unusual circumstances under which Harris got into the race. We'll talk about both of those theories tonight. And depending on how you felt on election night when the results became clear, you'll either conclude that the victory was in fact an overall realignment, or that it was something in which Democrats need to retrench, regroup, and rethink how they're going to proceed in American politics going forward, or alternatively, that this was a one-off, and the timing of Joe Biden's decision, the nature and the brevity of Kamala Harris's candidacy, and the unique nature of the campaign she ran really had more to do with the outcome than any larger sweeping historical factors. We'll talk through both of those alternatives, but before we do, I want to bring Maddie into this conversation because Maddie, I know you've been thinking about this also. You and I have been watching Trump and Harris for, I was going to say for months now,
Yeah.
but for exactly 114 days. since Joe Biden withdrew from the race and Harris became the Democratic nominee for president. So where do you think we ought to be taking this discussion tonight?
Well, I think that the first question that I want to ask you off the bat, and especially in respect to our audience, as we know which way they tend to lean, is do you think that there was a chance for Kamala Harris to win? Do you think that she could have won?
Well, it's the right question to ask. And to me, the answer to that question, if I possessed it, would tell us which of the two alternatives I just laid out would be the more accurate one.
Mm.
In other words, if you think this was a historical realignment, like 1932, like 1980, then there's nothing Harris could have done to win. If you believe, on the other hand, that this was a result driven more by individual characteristics of Biden and Harris and the nature of this campaign, then there are decisions she might have made that could have led to a victory. I'll admit this to you, Maddie, that like most observers, I anticipated this to be a very close race. And so after the election had taken place, I was thinking that depending on which candidate was defeated, Trump or Harris, there might be specific strategic or tactical decisions that could be pointed to for their defeat. So, for example, for Harris, we could have revisited her selection of Minnesota Governor Tim Walz as her running mate, and whether, in retrospect, either Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania, or Mark Kelly, the senator from Arizona, would have made more sense. We could have discussed her advertising strategy, the messaging that she emphasized in the closing days of the campaign. But those are the types of things that would change in a very close race. And because Trump did win this campaign very persuasive, pretty decisively, I think it's harder to look back at an individual specific strategic or tactical decision and pin the blame on this. So I guess to answer your question, I would say this, that the timing of Biden's decision, not the fact that he withdrew from the race, but the fact that he withdrew so late, just 107 days before the election, put Harris in an extremely difficult position with a tremendously uphill fight ahead of her. Had Biden withdrawn in December or January, there might have been a full primary process through the spring and summer in which Harris would have undoubtedly participated, along with Gretchen Whitmer and Gavin Newsom and any number of other potential candidates. And we would have had a chance to see, more importantly, Democratic primary voters would have had a chance to see whether she was the most capable and best qualified Democratic candidate to take on Trump in a general election. Biden did not make that decision. Of course, that didn't happen. Had Biden withdrawn, not in December or January, but even in June, a few days after his debate with Donald Trump, instead of almost a month afterward, even then, there might have been a chance for somewhat of a abbreviated, a truncated competitive process. And Nancy Pelosi did an interview at the New York Times this past weekend where she talked about this and how she believed that if Biden did step down, which she clearly thought was the right thing to do, that there would be some kind of competition, primaries, debates, candidate forums, something or other. And as Pelosi pointed out, once Biden endorsed Harris, that really eliminated that possibility. So when you've got a very short time frame for Harris, doesn't make the race impossible, but it makes it very, very difficult. What I think may have turned the campaign from difficult to virtually impossible for Harris was her own innate caution as a candidate. Harris, throughout her career, has always been very careful and very cautious, both from a policy perspective and in the way she expresses herself verbally. And her associates have always said that as someone who is trained as an attorney, she learned very early on in her professional life the importance of being careful with her word choice. So Kamala Harris has many incredible strengths and talents as a candidate, but I do believe in a race with such a short timeline available to her, in which she had only 15 weeks to get to know the American people, or should I say, to give for the American people to get to know her, that innate caution almost certainly worked against her. It's worth remembering now that she and her campaign chose for her not to do mainstream media interviews for roughly the first month of her campaign, taking that already very small window and making it even shorter. And as the campaign progressed, we saw her offering policy proposals. We saw her making somewhat of an effort to separate herself from Biden. And this is not meant as criticism, just assessment, but where that caution could have come in handy in many other types of political circumstances. Given just such a short amount of time available, it might, I think, a more aggressive candidate might have been better positioned. So could a Democrat have been elected last week? Uphill fight, but probably. But in retrospect, hindsight being 2020, Harris might not have been the best positioned candidate for this particular very unusual set of circumstances. But we have quite a bit of else to talk about. And so I think what we want to do at this point is I'm going to ask Krista to put up the first question for all of you. And we're going to switch the conversation from Harris herself to a broader conversation of the issues that shaped the campaign. And then Maddie and I'll talk about that a little bit later. So our first question for all of you, what issue do you believe, and I can see many of you already voting, what issue do you believe was the most important to voters in the presidential campaign? You see the overwhelming majority of you, more than 90% it appears, saying the economy and inflation, and most public opinion polls have reflected that. 1% saying abortion and healthcare, and we're going to talk about that in just a minute or two, and why that issue wasn't more important to more voters, and how that relative lack of importance may have impacted the Harris campaign's strategy. Immigration and border ranking in just about 9%, still far, far below economy and inflation, but a distant second. And foreign policy and none of the above, along with abortion rights and healthcare, coming at a very minimal levels. But look at that, 86% of our respondents believe, not surprisingly, that the economy is what drove this campaign. And that's exactly right. And my own feeling looking at those numbers and similar poll numbers released after the election took place is that this immense skew worked to Trump's advantage in a way that put Harris in an even more difficult position. We've known all along from looking at public opinion polls. We've known for the 3.5 months of Harris's campaign and for months before that when Biden was running against Trump. We knew that Trump's greatest advantages in terms of issue preference with the voters were the economy and inflation and immigration border. We knew that abortion rights and democracy were the two issues that worked most effectively for Democrats. And if we had known in June or July or August or September that this is the basis on which the American people would make their decision, it's very difficult to see a way that Harris or any other Democrat might have won. But before we go on and talk and go deeper into these issues, I think what I want to do is, Krista, if you can put up a second poll question. We asked all of you a moment ago, can we put up question number 2? We asked you what you thought was the most important issue to the voters. And the vast majority of you said the economy. Yeah, a smaller percentage said immigration. This is a second and a somewhat different question. We're not asking what you think the voters believe was the most important issue. We're asking what was the most important issue to you as a human being. And we're going to dig deeper into that as we see the numbers come in. And I'm already able to tell that we're getting a much different set of responses here. Remember, 89% of our respondents said that the voters felt that the economy was the most important issue. For our group itself, we're seeing only 12% saying the economy. 30% are saying abortion rights and healthcare. And had that number, 29%, 30%, had that level of import for the abortion rights and reproductive rights issue held across the electorate, I suspect we would have seen a much different outcome on election day. As Richard and Maddie already noted, we've got a terrific group here that does, given our geography, lean somewhat leftward. So it shouldn't be surprising that our group prioritizes the issue of abortion more than a national electorate. But that difference, I think, as much or more than anything else, tells us what's really impacted this campaign. And I'm going to come back to the abortion issue in just a minute. But Maddie, if we can, actually, let's keep talking. Let's keep talking about abortion, can we? We'll come back to the economy a little bit later.
Sure, let's do it.
Okay, so where do you want to take this discussion, knowing that we want to stay on this issue, given the incredible disparity between the overall electorate's priorities in our own group?
Yeah. Yeah, based on these results, I'm wondering, I guess, seeing how overwhelmingly we all thought, or I guess the results showed that 29% was leaning towards, or I'm sorry, 89% was leaning towards economy and inflation in what issue is most important, compared to our group being 29% with the highlight on abortion and healthcare. I'm wondering why you think that abortion rights didn't have as much of an impact on the election as we expected it to.
Well, I think it's a great question. And to me, out of all the exit poll results that we'll talk about over the course of this hour and over the weeks and months ahead, the one result that stuck out to me more than any other was on the question of abortion rights. We know that since the Supreme Court ruled on Dobbs 2.5 years ago, we know that the number of Americans who identify as pro-choice, who say that they believe abortion should be legal under all or most circumstances, we now know that that number has grown dramatically. And in fact, according to Gallup polling, 63% of Americans identify as pro-choice according to that definition. Now, when the results were broken down by beliefs on that issue, those self-described pro-choice voters split absolutely evenly between Harris and Trump. 49% of pro-choice Americans said they supported Harris. 49% said that they supported Trump. Now, go back to what I said a moment ago. According to Gallup, 63% of Americans identify as pro-choice. What that means is that 1 out of every 4 pro-choice voters in America, 1 out of every 4 voters who believe that abortion should be illegal under all or most circumstances, voted for Donald Trump instead of for Kamala Harris. And so that they decided, not all or not even most pro-choice voters, but an incredibly large number of roughly a quarter, roughly 25% of American pro-choice voters voted for Trump, believing that there was an other issue, almost always either inflation or the border, that was more important to them than reproductive rights. The Harris campaign strategy, make no mistake about it, was tied very specifically to the idea of turning out as many female voters as possible, and in particular, turning out as many pro-choice voters as possible. To some degree, they were successful in those efforts. The downside is that a very large number of the pro-choice voters that they turned out for Donald Trump, not because they didn't believe in the importance of abortion rights, but because they believed that economic and inflationary issues and or border issues were more important to them. Given that prioritization, there was no way that Harris could get elected president. So I think what we want to do now is, if we can, let's shift briefly from the past to the future, because one of the reasons, and Krista, if you can hold off for just 1 second, but I'm going to ask you in just a minute to put up the next poll question. What we've learned as we've talked to voters over the last week is that Trump and his campaign were extremely successful at blurring the distinction between himself and Harris on the abortion issue. Harris made it very clear as often as she could that she supported reproductive rights and that Donald Trump didn't. And Trump, as most of you know and most of you saw, spent most of the fall campaign saying that he would not sign a national ban against abortion. And in fact, his primary argument was not that abortion should be banned or not, but that each state should make that decision for themselves. And so it appears that a relevant number of pro-choice voters took him at his word and said, well, Donald Trump might not agree with me on that issue. He's not going to do anything to keep my state from changing it. And while we're still sifting through the data, the fact that Trump did so much better than he did 4 years ago in deep blue states like California and New York suggests that a lot of voters in blue states believe that if their states could protect reproductive rights, that they could therefore cast their presidential ballot on another issue. So the question of a national abortion ban is critically important. The argument that Trump made about leaving abortion to the states, for each state to decide for itself, may have been determinative. I'm going to ask this group, or I'm going to ask Krista now to ask this group, what you think about that pledge from Trump. Do you believe Donald Trump when he says that abortion should be left to the states? Pretty straightforward. Yes, I believe him. No, I think he will push for a national ban. Or a third option. I want you to make sure you read the third option before you vote. Because he will try to make it harder without an official ban. And I see the largest number of our group, very politically savvy, heading in that direction. We're now well over 50%, heading up close to 60%, saying while there will not be an official national ban of abortion, that you believe that the Trump administration will attempt to make it more difficult to get an abortion, particularly, presumably, in those states where abortion is allowed. So here we got 60% say that it won't be abortion right won't be illegal nationwide, but will become more difficult. And this gets into conversations about medication, about so-called abortion deserts in red states, and it's a much more complicated conversation. And Trump, we should make it clear, Trump didn't win this argument, but he won over just enough pro-choice voters by blurring that distinction. And I would argue that that was a fundamental aspect in his victory. I think one of the reasons that the economy and border issues ranked so much higher in voters' minds is because so many voters did take him at his word that he would not try to impose a national ban. And look at this, Maddie. If you separate out those who said he'll try to make it harder, that's 60%, even of our left-leaning group, more of the remaining respondents believe Trump, that he won't try to pass a national ban than those who did. I find that very, very interesting.
I do as well.
So we've talked a little bit about the economy, and we'll come back to it more. We've talked a good amount about abortion rights. But let's move on to the other issue that we believe for most of the summer and fall was going to define this election. And if abortion rights were an issue that united the Democratic base with most swing voters in America, the issue of undocumented immigration and border issues in particular united the Republican base with those swing voters. So just as it was unsurprising that Democratic candidates from Harris on down talked about abortion whenever they could, well, Republican candidates from Trump on down tried to talk about immigration whenever they could. Now, before I get into this analysis more, we're going to ask another poll question of you. And this is not an analysis question like many we ask you. We're asking you for your personal preference. And Krista, if we can put up question number 4. Question for you, your own personal beliefs. Do you support mass deportation of undocumented immigrants? And I'd ask you to check out all 3 options. 1, yes, the U.S. should try to deport all undocumented immigrants. 2, yes, the U.S. should try to deport all undocumented immigrants with criminal records. So it's a little bit of a misleading option. So it's not trying to deport all undocumented immigrants, but trying to deport all those who are undocumented who have criminal records on other issues. And then the third option, of course, is no, I oppose mass deportation. So Maddie, look, these numbers are still finalizing, but that's very interesting. I'm not surprised that only 4% of our group thinks that the U.S. should try to deport all undocumented immigrants. And we'll come back to that option in just a moment. But for the most part, the other 2 options are almost tied. And now, as we finalize, we see that, in fact, even for our somewhat blue group, more of our respondents, almost half, 49%, believe that the U.S. should try to deport all undocumented immigrants with criminal records, and 46%, just by a hair's breadth, a little bit less, say, no, I oppose mass deportation across the board. Now, just as our poll numbers on what was the most important issue in the campaign varied significantly from all voters to our group, poll respondents on this issue are very different also. When this question was asked of all American voters this fall, 57% said yes to the first option. Yes, the U.S. should try to deport all undocumented immigrants. And this is a poll question that did not distinguish between those with criminal records and those which did not. And so for those voters for whom this was an issue that helped contribute to their vote, it should be clear that Trump will take office with a fairly strong majority of American support, at least on that basic issue of mass deportation or not. Now, the reason we frame the question the way we did for all of you is because, as you might suspect, these answers get much more complicated when we start drawing distinctions. Most Americans do believe that undocumented immigrants with criminal records should be the first priority for deportation. And they're somewhat split after that on whether other undocumented immigrants should be deported or not. At the same time, though, we see equally large majorities, sometimes even larger, of those who want to see the dreamers, the DACA recipients, those who came here as young children with their parents, want to see them achieve citizenship. A majority of Americans want to see undocumented migrants who have married an American citizen become citizens. The majority of Americans want to see a pathway of citizenship for other undocumented migrants with certain conditions. So on the broadest level, Trump does have fairly strong majority support for the type of mass deportation program that he and his early appointees have talked about. But when you break down those numbers more specifically, you see how much more complicated an issue this becomes. And I'll know we'll come back to this in the second portion of our program also. But the last thing I want to do before we open it up to questions from all of you, because as many of you have heard me say a lot of times in the past, my favorite part of the program by far is when I stop the monologue and this becomes a conversation. So I want to shift for just a couple of minutes before we open it up to all of you from the issues to the candidates. Now, I talked at the beginning of the program tonight about Biden's decision and the timing of it and the potential challenges that may have caused for Harris. But I'm going to ask you a broader question. So, Krista, if we can put up number 5. So we're going to ask you, as you can see, did Joe Biden do the right thing by stepping aside? Yes, he did the right thing. And that first option should be he did the right thing and he did it at the right time. The second option is a bit more clear. Yes, he did the right thing, but he should have done it at the end of last year when there would have been enough time for a primary process. Third option, yes, he did the right thing, but he should have announced back in 2020 that he wouldn't run for re-election. And then finally, last answer, no, he didn't do the right thing. He should have stayed in the race. That all of the challenges that Harris had getting known to the American public in such a short time, particularly difficulty she had in the Rust Belt states, in Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin, that Biden all won, that maybe the Democratic Party would have been after all with Biden as the candidate. And I'm looking at these responses coming in, and our group clearly does not think Biden should have stayed in the race. Only 3% say that. Only 6% believe he did the right thing by getting out on July 21st. Look at that sweeping majority, 60%, almost 2/3 believe that Biden should have stepped aside at the end of 2023. And as I was saying earlier, that would have perhaps allowed for a competitive primary contest to emerge with any number of Democratic candidates, including Harris. One thing that we can always speculate on is whether Harris would have emerged victorious from that primary or not, or whether another Democrat would have been selected to run against Trump in 2024. We'll never know. But also very interesting, 31% of our group, almost 1/3, believe that Biden should have said all the way back in 2020 that he wouldn't run for re-election. Many of you may remember that he said he wanted to be a transitional president. That sort of implied that he was not going to run for re-election. But the people I know and who I respect in Washington the most say that once Biden saw how favorable the results of the 2022 midterm elections were for him, that at that point is when he decided to go forward with a re-election campaign. But look at that, 60% say he should have stepped aside at the end of last year. and another 31% who said he should have made it clear from the beginning in 2020 he wouldn't run for re-election. Last question, and then we'll get to your broader questions. I'm going to ask you the same question that Maddie asked me at the beginning of this program. We talked about the challenges that Harris faced. We didn't have as much time to talk about her skills and strengths as a candidate, but I don't think anybody on this call was not familiar with the way the campaign unfolded. So question for you as you're all answering. Do you think Harris could have won? I said it would have been possible, but very difficult. I wasn't nice enough to give you that option. You got a simple yes or no one. And so it looks like by a majority, but not a huge one, 58, 59% going back and forth, say that Harris could have won under other circumstances. And perhaps in the last 20 or 25 minutes, we can dig in a little bit about what those circumstances might have been. And 40% say no, there's no way she could have won under the circumstances which she became a candidate. Very interesting. As always, I find your poll results to be just absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much. And so Maddie, since we've gotten through all 6 questions, 60-40, look at that. 60% think she could have won under some circumstances. 40% say no way. So given all that, Maddie, given the poll questions, what do you say we go to more direct questions from the audience?
I think it's time because we have a ton rolling in and I want to try to get to as many as we can since we have a very curious audience today. So I do want to start with a question specifically talking about the Democratic Party's, I guess, mission and goals. And it's asking if you would be able to discuss the implications of the shift of the Democratic Party to appeal mostly to college-educated voters instead of its traditional blue-collar constituency, and how that might have impacted this election and also a lot of the Rust Belt and swing states that we talked about.
Boy, Maddie, I had vowed before we started today that I would try to give as short answers as possible to get to as many questions as possible. But that's a really great question and a really complicated one.
It really is.
The briefest version I can offer you is to say that for most of modern American history, partisan voting behavior was determined by income. The more money you made, the more likely you were to vote Republican. The less money you made, the more likely you were to vote. The less money you made, the more likely you were to vote Democrat. And that in the latter half of the 20th century and accelerated in the early years of the 21st century, we saw that begin to shift, where more and more high income and high education voters began to vote Democrat, and more voters with a high school education rather than a college degree, and therefore a lower level of earning, began to vote Republican. So we saw essentially a flip on those key indicators. And for years, just even as that shift was just beginning, the old saying is the Democratic Party is made up of a coalition of wine drinkers and beer drinkers. Wine drinkers, to indulge in one cultural stereotype, are upper income voters who are more socially moderate to liberal. Beer drinkers, to indulge in another cultural stereotype, tend to be more working class but more culturally conservative. And the very short version over the last generation or so is the wine drinkers beat the beer drinkers in the Democratic Party. The beer drinkers left, and the wine drinkers discovered that there weren't enough of them to win a general election. So how do the wine drinkers bring the beer drinkers back? And this is going to be the question more than any other that confronts the Democrats for the next 3.5 years. And the Democrats are not going to conclusively answer this question until they've picked their next nominee for president in the spring or summer of 2028. But very briefly, there's 2 strong arguments here. One that Bernie Sanders raised last week, the other that Nancy Pelosi rebutted Sanders with last weekend. What Sanders said several days ago, as I know most of you read, is that he believed that the Democratic Party has strayed from its working class economic roots. And if we're going to win back those beer drinkers, my designation, not his, he says we need a more economically populist platform. We're no longer reaching out to working class voters with an economic agenda. Nancy Pelosi, on the other hand, couldn't have disagreed more. She did an interview in the New York Times on Sunday in which she said, no, we're just fine on economic issues. Our problem with these voters is on cultural issues. And the language that she used, which many conservatives have in the past, is she said our problem is on issues like guns, gays, and God. And by God, she was referring very specifically to abortion rights. So she's making it clear that she thinks the party's biggest challenge was on cultural issues. I don't think you can completely separate them. And in fact, I suspect that a lot of voters who might have been tempted to support Harris saw her spending more time than they would have liked on social and cultural matters and not as much time on economic policy, which means that there's a piece of both Sanders and Pelosi in the final answer. But ultimately, every Democratic voter and every Democratic candidate is going to have to decide whether an economic repositioning or a cultural and social issue repositioning makes more sense. We'll see indications of what's a more effective approach in the midterm elections in less than 2 years, when Democratic candidates for governor and senator and Congress run on economically or socially centrist or blue collar issue agendas. And we'll see even more of it starting the following year, when a whole range of Democratic presidential candidates begin staking out either new economic turf or new ground on these cultural and social matters. And we won't know until there's a nominee in about 3.5 years. That's the challenge facing the Democratic Party if you believe that the party lost a sweeping defeat last week. If you believe that the flaws are with Biden's timing and Harris's candidacy, then as a Democratic partisan, you might think, well, we don't have to do anything. We just don't nominate Kamala Harris again, or we don't have a president step aside 15 weeks before an election. My guess, and it's just a guess, is that there's a lot more Democrats who think a more fundamental change is necessary. Whether it prioritizes economic or social policy, once again, will define the party's trajectory for the next 4 years at least.
Thank you. I feel like that you did actually keep that answer pretty short, all things considered, how complicated it was.
For me, but I'll try to.
Well, you're the star of the show, so obviously we want to hear the most from you, and we appreciate you taking the time to answer these questions. And our next question is talking a little bit more about going back to the candidate specifically. And this question has been asked probably 10 times, and I'm just condensing it down into one, which is, what role did race and gender, particularly in regard to Kamala Harris as a candidate, play in this election?
Well, here's what we know. We know that Harris actually got fewer votes from female voters than Joe Biden. And that can be interpreted in one of two different ways. It means either that a smaller gender gap rather than a larger one in this election suggests that for all the reasons Harris lost, gender was not one of them. In other words, if she lost more female voters, then the one interpretation is that meant that those women voted for Trump for reasons other than gender. The other argument is that not every woman automatically votes for every female candidate any more than every man votes for every male candidate. And just like there are a number of men in this country who are not yet ready to vote for a woman for president, there's still a number of women who are not prepared to either. And I know many of you either saw or read about the very well-known Julia Roberts ad that was posted in the last couple of weeks of the campaign, in which Roberts talked about how women could vote for candidates different than their husband. It's an ad that raised tremendous controversy in conservative circles, but was designed specifically for this question, to convince women who might be hesitate to vote for a female candidate that they should feel comfortable doing so. So we don't know yet which one of those two interpretations is correct. It's entirely possible that Harris lost for reasons having nothing to do with her gender. It's possible that gender was the driving force behind her defeat. And it's going to be, for better or worse, weeks, if not months of additional research before we have a better sense for this. I will note that in 2016, Hillary Clinton, while she, of course, did not become president because she did not win the Electoral College, Hillary Clinton did win a majority of votes from the American people, which suggests that at least under some circumstances, the majority of Americans will vote for a female candidate. We know from Barack Obama's elections that the majority of Americans will, at least under certain circumstances, vote for a non-white candidate. Do we know from this one single example that a majority of Americans will not vote for a non-white female candidate? We don't know that. And not only is there a lot more research that needs to be done before we can answer that question, we're going to see a lot more non-white women run for office before we have enough of a database to come to a better conclusion on such an important question.
Thank you so much for that, Dan. Our next question, still keeping on the topics of candidates. So right after the assassination attempt on President-elect Trump's life in, what was it, in Pennsylvania, I want to say, in Bucks County? Yes. That we kind of talked about that the day after it happened. I think that was when our meeting, our September meeting was. I want to say that was September. And we didn't actually think it was going to have too much of an impact on the election at the time when we discussed it, if I'm recalling correctly. But this question is asking, actually, now that we have the results of the election, if you think that it actually did have a greater impact on the election than anticipated.
I would say this, that the attempted assassination on Donald Trump did have more of an impact than we anticipated. And as odd as this sounds, in a different way than we've been measuring. It doesn't appear that the attempted assassination against Trump caused many voters to change their minds about who they supported. Voters did not move as a result of that from Harris to Trump, or for that matter, from Trump to Harris. What did seem to happen, though, is the shooting, which was a very important component of the Trump campaign's closing advertising campaign in the last couple of weeks before Election Day. It appeared that the shooting and the memory of it and the visuals of it did motivate a large number of Trump supporters to vote. We know that the Republican base turned out in much greater numbers than the Democratic base did in this election. Democratic voters, for any number of reasons, were simply less inspired to turn out to the polls. It is clear that many Republican loyalists who may or may not have voted otherwise were inspired by being reminded of the Trump shooting, and in particular the impact it had. One thing we haven't talked about tonight is what I think is an extraordinary gamble that the Trump campaign took, that we talked about briefly a month ago, where the Trump campaign decided that they believed that if they could convince large numbers of young working class men, young men without a college education, if they could convince young men without a college education to turn out and vote, that they would turn out overwhelmingly for Trump. Now, research shows us that young working class men, young men without a college education, vote in much smaller percentages than every other demographic in society. And they certainly vote a lot less in smaller numbers than young women do. But the Trump campaign believed that if they could get these young men to vote, of all races and ethnicities, white, black, Latino, across the board, they believed that that could help fuel their victory. And it became clear in the closing weeks of the campaign that along with all the podcasts that Trump was doing, Joe Rogan and others, along with his appearance at Ultimate Fighting events, along with the campaign's presence in advertising and video games, they were reaching these young non-college educated men in all sorts of ways, that the video of Trump surviving the shooting did have a very motivational effect on those young men. And the turnout of those young, low propensity male voters cannot be overstated. Donald Trump ended up getting roughly 25% of the black male vote in this country, almost all because of the turnout among young black men. Trump became the first Republican presidential candidate in the history of polling to win a majority of the Latino male vote, and that was driven largely by young working class men. And it would be oversimplifying things to say that these young men elected Donald Trump president, but they played a major contributing role. And the images and the visuals of his shooting had a very important impact on their decisions to turn out to vote.
Thank you. Our next question is, what can we expect from a second Trump administration in regards to education?
Right. We don't know yet. And I've been joking about this for a while, but I learned not to make predictions about Donald Trump about 9 years ago. And I do my best not to break that promise. But that said, I think we can look not just at what he has said, but how his crowds have reacted to his various pledges. I'll give you just two examples for us to focus on going forward. We know that Trump has called for the elimination of the Department of Education, or more specifically, the merger of the Department of Education with the Department of Labor. And his advisors' argument is that education and workforce preparation should be handled all under one roof. But the end result of that, in all likelihood, would be a tremendous reduction in federal spending on education related matters. My opinion, and this is just a guess, is that that step, even though it's been frequently repeated, is a relatively unlikely one. First, I think it's going to be very difficult for Trump, even with a 53-vote Republican majority in the Senate, to get 60 votes in the Senate to eliminate the department. But second, I think if you watch Donald Trump on the campaign trail, if you watch him talking at rallies to his most loyal supporters, you can see that he is most energized when they are most energized. And when he talks about eliminating the Department of Education, he gets some cheers. The education issue that really does seem to excite his supporters, and therefore I think is much more likely to motivate Trump and his advisors, is the issue of what the movement refers to as parental rights, particularly in the area of transgender policy. And the debate over whether parents, when and how parents should be informed of their children's decisions on these matters has become extremely heated. The ad that the Trump campaign ran using the podcast host and the DJ Charlemagne the God, the very prominent Black entertainment personality, talking about gender identity and transgender related issues. A lot of people on both the Harris and the Trump campaigns believe that that was the most impactful advertisement of the entire campaign. And so while the Department of Education in some ways might make more sweeping change, given the way Trump does react to his crowds of supporters, I wonder if a discussion of parental rights and transgender related issues might end up being the most sweeping education related debate that we see over the next 4 years.
Thank you. I'm also wondering, and I'm kind of compiling some questions here, is though we could see from our group's vote that foreign policy was not viewed as the most important issue on either one of the questions that we asked, what impact do you think it had, and particularly in regards to Israel and Palestine on the election?
Well, it is a really good question. And we know from the polls that most voters did not make their decision based on foreign policy, whether in the Middle East, in Ukraine, in the Pacific Rim, or anywhere else in the world. But I do believe that the Gaza war did create a very sizable political challenge, first for Biden and then for Harris, for a few reasons. One, of course, it's an issue that split the Democratic base. And so far, we've seen polling results, as I mentioned earlier, that showed that core Democrats, progressive Democrats, voted in smaller numbers this year than they did 4 years ago. We don't yet know how much of that is as a result of the war in Gaza and the Biden administration's support for Israel throughout that war, but it's not hard to see that as a contributing factor, in particular when you consider that the city of Dearborn, Michigan, which is an overwhelmingly majority Arab American population, which voted for Biden by a 2-to-1 margin over Trump 4 years ago, voted for Trump majority in this election. So I don't want to extrapolate from a single town in Michigan to much broader conclusions, but it wouldn't surprise me, as more research is done, if we do see the Gaza debate as having had a very discouraging effect on Democratic-based turnout. The other impact I think it may have had, particularly with working class and with suburban voters, is that another issue that Trump has used very effectively, along with inflation and the border, of course, is the issue of crime. And the video that most of the country and most of the world saw last spring, and to a lesser extent, but still present this fall, over campus rallies and protests often becoming somewhat violent, creates a sense of danger, a sense of unsettlement, and dislocation among voters. And if voters don't feel comfortable, if they don't feel safe, they're that much less likely to vote for an incumbent. If you have Trump already selling a very anti-crime message, I do wonder if those protests and those rallies, particularly those that did become confrontational and those that did become violent, may have added to a general mood of unease in this country that contributed to voters' thoughts on issues like criminal justice and border reform. So people didn't say Gaza was the reason I voted the way I did, but I think in a number of ways, including the two I just mentioned, it almost certainly had a contributing effect.
You okay? Continuing to talk about that, and kind of pouring into a little bit about what a little bit more back about what the Trump administration is going to look like. We had someone who mentioned that Trump has mused about pursuing a third term, despite that obviously no longer being a legal possibility. Do you think that that's something he'll legitimately pursue? And what would have to happen for that sort of thing to be possible?
Again, I don't make predictions when it comes to Donald Trump. He has said that he has no interest in serving another term in office after this one. And he said during the campaign on a number of occasions that if he lost this race, he would not run again in 2028. I think it's unlikely, though, not because Trump lacks the ambition. He certainly doesn't. But I do think that as Trump will be in his early 80s by the time he concludes his first term in office, and given that many even supporters of Trump have noticed what they categorize as some diminishment in him over the last 8 years, I feel that if he does, from a health standpoint, make it through 4 more years, the likelihood of him deciding 4 additional years beyond that is in his interest is unlikely, particularly given the immense effort it would take in order to make that change. This would require a change of the U.S. Constitution, and we have not had a constitutional amendment successfully passed in this country for more than 50 years. And if you believe, as I do, that every president loses a great deal of political capital after midterm elections, that a third or fourth year in office, or a 7th or 8th year in office, Donald Trump, with the diminished political capital that comes after probably frustrating midterm elections for him, I just don't know that Trump at that point will have the political clout, even within his own party, to move the kind of support he would need to in order to amend the U.S. Constitution. So everything's possible. We've learned over the last 8 or 9 years, but that's one I have a very, very difficult time seeing.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We have a question asking whether or not you yet have a reaction to Trump's announced appointments. And for those who might not know, Chief of Staff is Susie Wiles, the Border Czar is Tom Haman, and then for the Department of Government Efficiency, there's Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. So far, that's who's been announced. I'm just wondering what your initial reaction to that is.
Well, and of course, any number of other appointments as well. I think the other ones worth mentioning are Senator Marco Rubio's appointment as Secretary of State, and announced just a few hours ago, Trump selected the Fox News host, Pete Hegseth, to be his defense secretary. Hegseth has hosted a program on Fox for many years. He's a military veteran before that, so he does have some grounding in these issues. But I have a couple of thoughts, particularly with the naming of Rubio as Secretary of State, and given his appointments for UN Ambassador and National Security Advisor also. These are very conservative selections, but they're also somewhat conventional selections. Marco Rubio, for example, is not a MAGA Republican. He and Donald Trump fought very fiercely during their primary campaign against each other in 2016. And even though they've made amends and Rubio's become a very strong ally of Trump since then, he does represent a more traditional conservative Republican approach to foreign policy and international relations. And so most of Trump's appointees so far, while conservative, not surprisingly, do seem to be more conventional than many people had expected. And the great exception to that so far, there's a couple of them, but the great exception to that so far is him announcing a television host, even one with military experience, as Secretary of Defense. So during Trump's first term in office, we saw a lot of infighting between his advisors and his cabinet members. It seemed up until this afternoon that Trump was going to do everything he could to avoid that type of infighting in his next term. But by beginning to put together a cabinet with both Rubio and Hegseth, it looks like he is setting himself for some pretty fierce internal fights. All of which is to say, as we're going to say so often with Donald Trump going forward, we just don't know yet. But we know that Richard's rejoined us, which means it's time to wrap this up, doesn't it?
I truly wish we were not wrapping this session up, Dan. This has been absolutely fascinating. Thank you very, very much. And by the way, this dialogue will continue for our members in the members only session, but this has been a truly very, very interesting discussion. And this is a dialogue that we look forward to continuing with you, Dan, in the future, because there's much more to come as things unfold. We're just starting to see these appointments. We're starting to see the policies that potentially come out. And so we look forward to a lot more ahead with you. Thank you so much.
I'm looking forward to it also. I know we're going to do an in-person program next week, and we're back on Zoom again in December. So I'm excited to keep the conversation going.
Right. Well, and let me tell you, for all of our audience out there, by the way, I want to thank our audience members. That was terrific. I don't know if this is a record in terms of questions. I think there were about between 90 and 100 questions. I don't know, but that was, I want to thank our audience for being so engaged. And Madison, you did a wonderful job in terms of trying to integrate, as always, integrate so many questions, which I think you did very, very well. But for our audience members, I want to let you know, we just started with our first hybrid webinar in-person event on the 1st of November. Some of you may have joined us. It was with Stephen Cook, who's an expert on the Middle East from the Council on Foreign Relations. It was an experiment that worked out pretty well. We had some bumps, but we're going to do more of these in the future, and we really look forward with Dan to work these. I know many of you would like to come to see Dan in person, and I know Dan would like to do that too. There's a lot more energy when you have people all together as well as on the webinar. So we look at doing that. So that's something for the way ahead. And as Dan mentioned, we're going to arrange something for in person next week to continue this dialogue. So we look forward to that. I do want to remind you again, we are off and running now with our Los Angeles World Affairs Council end of year giving campaign. So please, for those of you who are in a position to donate, we really appreciate you would do so. We thank those of you who have given, but if you're able to give, we really need your support to help continue this not only this program, but many others that we look forward to coming. So please help us if you can. And again, you've seen where to donate on either our website, on the chat there, or send a check. So again, thank you all for joining us tonight. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Madison. Thanks to Krista Seitz, who was handling the back end of this part of the questions and so forth, who did a great job as well and helped put this together. So I wish you all a great night, and thanks for joining us tonight. Thank you.
Thanks everybody.
Thank you.